Okay, so coming to you from another different location, trying to keep things interesting. And my house was getting kind of crazy with all the kids. So, today we're going to talk about Heidegger. Um, and Heidegger's writing in the 1920s. He's German. He's from the Black Forest region, which is um, kind of the more backwards areas of Germany, at least at that time. At least it's viewed that way. Perhaps like the deep south of the United States or the hills of West Virginia are viewed by others to be very backward, very isolationist thinking, so on and so forth, which sometimes leads to more extremist thinking. But we'll get to more of that story later. So Heidegger, in many ways, is really setting the scene for 21st century philosophy. He's wanting to make philosophy more relatable again. So we've gone from Seneca and Lucretius and Augustine to Montaigne during the Renaissance to Schopenhauer in the early to mid 1800s. And now we're moving just beyond that. But a lot has changed in the world by the time the 1920s arrive. Especially on the continent of Europe, which is primarily what we're focusing on because it's Western philosophy. We've had a world war, which of course wasn't the entire world, but it was all of Europe, which as far as they were concerned was the entire world, right? And that had massive implications for thought thereafter. So we'll see Heidegger focuses a lot on the concept of death, something that, those early philosophers mentioned, oh yeah, we're going to die, so we should probably live now, don't fear death, so on and so forth. But then that idea kind of gets forgotten in the intervening years because philosophy tends to focus more on the knowledge stuff, which we'll get to starting next week. And it kind of got away from practical, what does philosophy mean for living my life right here and now? And so Heidegger's trying to get back to that. And so it'll be interesting that he's going to reference not Plato and Aristotle. And those are the two guys we're going to start with but when we start discussing knowledge next week. This week we're still talking about Heidegger, and we're going to talk about the remnants of Heidegger, right? We're going to follow some trails post-Heideggerian up to fairly contemporary philosophy. But he's not going to go back to Plato and Aristotle. He's going to go back before Plato and Aristotle. He's going to go back to a time, to the philosophers that he thinks were focusing on how to live life. Heidegger takes himself to be much more of a practical philosopher. And so that's why he's going to start by asking about the question of the meaning of being, right? Where we started this class, human life and its meaning. Pardon me. So not only has World War I occurred, and so death is everywhere, right? I mean, so much of the continent of Europe was wiped out in World War I, especially Germans, and Heidegger's German. But beyond that, too, we had these really interesting ideological shifts at the beginning of the 1900s. We had the special theory of relativity by Einstein that was published, and then had intellectual ramifications after that. We had crazy things going on in the arts and in music. Igor Stravinsky, The Rites of Spring, was so innovative, so crazy, so far out there musically that the audience at the first performance in New York threw a riot. There was a riot after a classical music performance. That's crazy. You've got Sigmund Freud writing about psychology and so on and so forth in the early 1900s. So this is a crazy, crazy time. And Heidegger's writing kind of at the very end of that and kind of at the beginning, sort of anticipating some other things to come later. World War II hasn't happened yet, but of course that's going to have major ramifications for the second half of the 20th century. And Heidegger's going to start here, and I should give some more background on Heidegger. Before Heidegger turned to philosophy, he was studying to be a Jesuit priest. And so Christianity, and specifically Jesuit Catholicism, will still appear in his thinking. Okay? He's dismissed the idea of God and so forth, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that's still right there. Um, he Another reason he's turning toward being itself and just starting there. His philosophical mentor, Edmund Husserl, kept wanting to talk about being and existence, but never got around to it because he got so bogged down in subject-object talk, so bogged down in metaphysics, a term I talked about 2 weeks ago, so bogged down in knowledge and justified, true belief, so on and so forth, but that he never got around to the practical work of what does philosophy mean for us as existing creatures right here, right now, today. And so Heidegger doesn't want to make that same mistake. So he's going to start with being, with a big capital B. And Heidegger's also doing some interesting things linguistically here, right? And this is in translation from the German. But there's a distinction to be drawn between being with a capital B and beings with a lowercase b. Being with a capital B refers to the concept of existence itself. Being as a concept. Beings with a lowercase b refers to specific entities, us, existing things. Now there's a relation between the two, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But there's a distinction to be drawn between those two uses of the same word, being and beings. Capital B, lowercase b. Okay? So he's just going to dive right in. And these are, of course, excerpts from a larger work. The larger work is Being and Time, Sein und Zeit. And it was his dissertation for his PhD in philosophy, and really made a name for himself on the, at least European scene, and to some extent the international scene as well. And I'll talk more about that story in a little bit as well. So the excerpt begins, and so right around this time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, in continental philosophy, because they're doing something so large, right? I talked the first week about the distinction between continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy, because it's much more precise and much more narrowed down, you can kind of take excerpts fairly easily. Continental philosophy is trying to do much more holistic. They're trying to do the wisdom thing instead of the knowledge thing. So it's much more difficult to kind of rip out particular passages without the context of the rest of it. So if as you were reading this you felt a little lost, that's okay. Part of the reason is we've kind of amped up the philosophical jargon a bit. We've amped up the philosophical essay, right? The other essays we read, yes, they were philosophy, but they were also much more accessible. Heidegger's a little less accessible because he's referencing other things going on in the history of philosophy that we haven't covered yet. And because we only have bits and pieces. Like his work, really, you have to kind of read in toto to really understand it, and really not just Being in Time, but kind of his whole corpus, his whole everything, so it continues to develop. And he lived until the mid-1970s, and he was continuing to write and so forth. So, but he starts here. The question of being has today been forgotten. Now, if someone's going to tell you, hey, something's been forgotten, that probably means, and I'm here to help remind us of it. I'm here to shift that focus back on this thing that we've forgotten, because this thing that we've forgotten is the thing of utmost importance. So by starting here, today, or the question of being, has today been forgotten? Heidegger's trying to refocus philosophy, scholars of it, regular everyday folk who are interested in it, people writing it, people teaching it, people reading it, anybody under the umbrella of philosophy. He's like, whoa, hold on, we got sidetracked. Let's get back to the question of being. I mean, if you think about the earliest humans, whomever they may have been, whenever that may have been, chances are the question of why probably occurred fairly early on in human development. Purpose, meaning, fulfillment, life, why existence? Those types of questions probably occurred pretty early on. right? And Heidegger is trying to get back to that. Like, look, these are the fundamental questions, not just of philosophy, but of life itself. Yes, biology is nice because it helps explain certain aspects of the body, but if we don't tie that back to existence itself, why does it matter? I mean, for Schrappe at least, it's very interesting. Biology, the study of life. And yet, in your biology class, I doubt that you talk about purpose and meaning and fulfillment, existence, why bother, suicide, why not, right? Those questions are left to philosophy, but they're questions of life, so perhaps they should be discussing those things in biology, the study of life. Math is great for figuring things out, but if it doesn't, I'm speaking on behalf of Heidegger here, if it doesn't tie back to why existence, then why does it matter? Even the courses that you're taking in college, if they're not applied practically to the way that you live your life, why the heck are you taking them? And if you're taking them only because the college is forcing you to, why the heck is the college forcing you to? In the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it talks about education. I forget which article it is. And it says that higher education, right, college education and so forth, should be about the development of the entirety of the person. Not just preparing you for a job, not just giving you skills, though that is a part of it, but it's also about developing you as a person. That's the justification for things like liberal arts. That's the justification for making a requirement of something like intro to philosophy or intro to ethics, is it should make you a more well-rounded person, which if you're a more well-rounded person, presumably you'll be a better employee wherever you end up getting a job anyway, because you'll just be a better person in general. But I digress because I get excited about this stuff. The question of being has today been forgotten, so he wants to go back. It is one which provided a stimulus for the researches of Plato and Aristotle, only to subside from then on as a theme for actual investigation. Right, so Plato and Aristotle, even though Schrappe will focus on them as far as the entry point to knowledge and how to figure out what the heck that is, what is justified true belief and is that enough, they were asking those types of questions simply to tie it back to the question of the meaning of being. Right, think about Rand's commencement speech at West Point, right? Who am I was the fundamental question. That was first, right? Who am I? Where am I? And these things are necessarily related. We're necessarily placed somewhere, and Heidegger will talk about that as well. So he goes on. Inquiry, thinking itself, inquiry is a kind of seeking. Thinking is trying to figure things out. And we're naturally curious, we are naturally inquisitive creatures, otherwise Google would have failed. Google is based upon the premise that we are curious and want to know things, and it allows us the chance and the way to look things up quickly. Google, Ask Jeeves, Yahoo, pick your question asker, Siri, whomever it may be, or whatever it may be. We ask it questions because we want to know answers. That's inquiry. Inquiry is guided by we want to know the answer. So that's a fundamental aspect, one of the universal conditions of human existence, of what it means to be us, of what it means to exist. We inquire. Inquiry is a kind of seeking, must be guided beforehand by what is sought. Right? We're searching for the answer to this particular question. Therefore, that answer that we don't yet have is what guides our questions. Think about sociology. And so, I don't know if you've ever been out in public and been asked one of these survey things or something along those lines. The wording of the questions themselves lead to certain answers. So here's an example from Schrappe's life. So this was a few years ago, and it was shortly before I had to go pick the kids up from school. And I get this phone call, hello, Mr. So-and-so. I don't know how they would have mispronounced it that day, but nobody ever gets it right the first try. Would you mind taking a quick 5-minute one-question survey? And obviously I was A, bored, plus two, I kind of feel sorry for those folks because so few people actually say, yes, let me take this phone survey. So I was like, yeah, why not? So they proceeded then to play an excerpt from a speech about the United Nations. And the end of this speech then, the question that was being asked was, do you think that countries like North Korea and China should be able to determine whether the United States citizens have the right to own guns? Now, obviously, this is a very loaded question. Obviously, the way the question is worded, there's a particular right answer. Right? Regardless of what your views on gun control may be, very, very, very few United Statesians would say, yes, of course China should decide whether we have the right to have guns or not. And so, unfortunately for this survey taker, they got me on the phone, me, the fellow who happens to teach philosophy. So I had some questions before I could answer their question. So I was like, whoa, hold on a second. Let's back up a few steps. In order to answer that question, we first have to ask other questions such as, do we think the United States should still be a member of the United Nations? In which case, whatever the United Nations as a whole decides, perhaps the United States should then also be a part of. So if all of the United Nations decides, hey, no guns for anyone, if we're one of the member institutions, then we have to go along with that, it would seem. She said, let me get my manager on the phone. That's probably a good idea. So the manager comes on the phone, and he says, Mr. So-and-so, don't you think every American has the right to own a gun? It says so in the Constitution. And I said, well, okay, first of all, I'm not sure that's exactly what the Constitution means, though that is what it says. Secondly, sir, this is me speaking to him, I'm not sure even you think every American citizen should have a gun, or should have the right to own a gun. He said, of course I do. And I said, really? Okay, so my son, who at the time I believe was 7, is an American citizen. Should he have the right to own a gun? Well, of course not, he's a child, aha. So it's every American citizen of a certain age. What about my 33-year-old friend with Down syndrome? Should he have the right to own a gun? Well, no, of course not. He has Down syndrome. Aha. So it's every American citizen of a certain age and of a certain mental capacity. See, it's tough because I can't turn this thing off. I'd like to just kind of turn this thing off sometimes, but I can't seem to do it. I had my kids sit in on one of my classes once because they were out of school. And I was like, so what do you think of, Dad the professor? And they were like, no different than Dad at home. Pretty much. So then I was like, all right, what about my 24-year-old friend who was recently released from prison? He's an ex-con. They're like, no, of course not him, especially if it's a violent crime. And I said, oh, okay, so every American citizen has now become every American citizen of a certain age, of a certain mental capacity, with a certain background. That's completely different. That's completely different. And I forget exactly how the conversation ended, but I never did actually answer their question. Turns out this was the NRA. And so again, based upon the wording of the question, there's already a certain answer that's being sought. Okay? That's not true inquiry, says Heidegger. Now, inquiry is guided by an answer that you want to find, that you legitimately don't know the answer to. The NRA knows, by phrasing it that way, what most folks are going to answer. I never ended up seeing the survey results. I would have been fascinated because it probably would have been like 99% of Americans think that China and North Korea should not determine that whether we have guns or not, which would be interpreted then, look, 99% of people surveyed think that we should have guns, which is not what the question was, but it's how the NRA would probably interpret the answers to the questions. But of course, I would have been that like 0.001% that was other. Because I didn't say yes, I didn't say no, but I did agree to take the survey, so I would have had to have been included in the results. Inquiry is sort of like, especially when we're talking about inquiry into the meaning of being itself, inquiry into existence. It's sort of like a treasure map. Like we have an idea of where this X might be, this X that marks the spot for the gold or the treasure or what have you. But there's a lot of work to get there. There's a lot of steps along the way. all of us, Heidegger thinks, have some idea of what it means to exist. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to actually exist. But we don't have a full and complete understanding of it. And so we continue to try to find out more and more and more, and inquire more and more and more into what is being, what is existence, why does it matter? Inquiry must be guided beforehand by what is sought. The answer to why. Why bother with existence? Right? Why not suicide? Why continue? So the meaning of being must already be available to us in some way. In some way. What are these ways? He calls them later in other writings clues. Clues to the meaning of being are found everywhere, as long as we actually recognize them as clues to the meaning of being. Why are there clues everywhere? Because everywhere there are beings who are being. There are entities that are existing. And not just existing. We're not like squirrels. We're not just existing. We also have the capacity to question existence itself. What he calls Dasein. Already got a bunch of writing on the board. I'll get to this in a minute. Well, in a few minutes, probably. Dasein, which is a German word that really just means being there. It really just means existence in space and time. That's it. There's no other baggage attached to it. Now he's going to start attaching baggage to it. I'm going to kind of hop around a little bit here in the text. This is the bottom of page 116. So I start at the top, and jump to the bottom, and I'll probably jump back to kind of the middle here in a minute. Dasein is an entity which does not just occur among other entities. Okay, so all existing things are not Dasein. Not in the way that he's meaning it. Do they all exist out there in time and space? Sure. But most of them aren't aware of their existence in time and space the way that we are, or the way that we at least could be. Rather, it is distinguished by the fact that in its very being, being is an issue for it. We therefore have a relationship towards being, relationship toward a capital B being. We can think about existence in a way that it seems unlikely squirrels do. Maybe they do, in which case they're in the same boat that we are, trying to figure out what the heck does all this for? Why existence? Why bother? Where is meaning and purpose and fulfillment to be found? Doesn't help us at all. It just makes things worse for the squirrels. Right? Because on one hand, the unexamined life is not worth living, says Plato. That just going through the day, just to go through the day, you're stuck in your routines, you're sleepwalking through life, as other philosophers have talked about. That doesn't really seem like living either. But overanalyzing absolutely everything probably isn't ideal either. And so for a good example of this, I'm going to turn to William James, an American philosopher who's writing about the same time period as William James. He wants to talk about perchings and flights. So imagine trees. Okay. And so imagine we're a bird in a nest in a tree. Okay? That's where we are. It's our nest of certainty. Okay? But then something happens. Unless we're walking through life like this, la 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 la, which is not ideal, and we'll see why. It leads to intellectual death. Unless we're going through life like that, there will be things which shake us, which force us then to question again. Probably things like, oh, I don't know, pandemics, continued racial strife, war, poverty. I mean, name your big issue. And if you're paying attention to these big issues, you're probably asking yourself questions. One of those questions is probably like, hey, can we fix it? If so, how? But it should also, if Heidegger is right, be forcing you to ask yourself the question of, well, what does it mean to exist anyway? How does this thing play into or run counter to the universal human condition? Because Heidegger hears about universality, the things that we all share. Do we all have particularities and quirks and eccentricities? Of course. It's what makes us unique. But there are also things that all of us have in common. Those things that we have in common must necessarily point to existence itself, the concept of being. Which again is why there are clues in the everyday. The things that all of us do could be clues as to what the point of life is, since all of us are doing it. And when I'm thinking about the fulfilled life, the meaningful life, I'm also thinking about the good life. And so I will put a plug in for, there's another video on this YouTube channel entitled The Good Life, which covers some of these similar topics, but in a slightly different context. It was for a different class, not intro to philosophy. And so I talk a little bit about Heidegger there, getting more in depth here, obviously. But I also talk about some of the folks we'll talk about next time, but I also talk about folks we're not going to talk about in this class. So if you find that video useful, go ahead and watch that one too. Good life, fulfilled life, meaningful life. Life. Right? Alright, so these clues that point to the meaning of being. Go back to William James. So we have these things that occur that kind of push us out of our nest of certainty. Okay? And so then we're forced to fly. This flying is inquiry. This flying is thinking itself. And again, what's the point of thinking? To find an answer, to find a solution, to get to another nest of certainty that we'll be in until something pushes us out of that one and we have to fly again. And so thinking and life is this series of perchings, being in the nest, and flights, being pushed out and having to fly. Notice, if you overemphasize either of these, you will die intellectually, because the bird will actually die physically. If the bird never leaves its nest, it will die of starvation. If you never leave your intellectual nest of certainty, your brain will atrophy. You already know everything that you need to know. You just continue to listen to people who agree with you so that you can have an expert to point to. See, so-and-so said so, so I must be right. Confirmation bias and all of that. And this thing will atrophy. It's a muscle that will never get worked out. You won't be an interesting person. And you'll never continue to develop and get closer to any type of answer for the question of the meaning of being, which is an ongoing thing, which is why I wrote it this way. In later writings, Heidegger himself will write it this way, with a hyphen between be and ing, to emphasize the ing, to emphasize the verb nature of existence. It's not a destination, like those things at the dentist's office. Life is not a destination, it's a journey. Yeah, kinda. Right? It's an ing. It's an always changing, developing thing. Whether it's self-discovery or self-creation, discovering and creating are both active, ongoing things. Being, ongoing, verbing. So if you just rest in the nest of certainty, you're going to die of starvation. Conversely, if all you're doing is questioning, if you are, we'll call it in philosophy, an excessive skeptic, right? That I talked about this the first week, right? Be a skeptic, a mitigated skeptic, right? Question things until the evidence convinces you. The excessive skeptic, the constant flyer, will never be convinced. We'll talk about this again toward the end of the course when we talk about agnostics. They'll never be convinced. There's no argument one way or the other which will ever convince them. They'll continue to fly. Now think of a bird that's constantly flying. It will also die of exhaustion. It'll never land anywhere to rest. This thing, just like any other muscle, could be overused and cause damage. Underuse, damage. Overuse, damage. It's this between the two. Just like if you're exercising other muscles in the body, right? You work them out, but then they also need time to rest and recover so that you can work them out again, so that you can get stronger. Same deal here. That's the perching and flight thing that William James, not Martin Heidegger, William James is talking about. Martin Heidegger agrees, though, right? He doesn't use this same visual, the same metaphor. But what he's getting at is something very, very similar. Inquiry itself, thinking. That's what Dasein does. That's what we're at least capable of doing. Now, not everyone does. Not everyone takes advantage of that. But we should. Because that's how the answer to the question of the meaning of being is going to be answered. So his answer to the question of the meaning of being, one, continue to question the meaning of being. That's one of the answers. The other answer is just exist, man. Just be. Live. Because whatever it is that you're doing, however it is that you're living, shows me and shows others what your answer to the question of meaning of being is. And your answer is a clue to the answer. Clues everywhere. And this comes to a distinction between authentic and inauthentic. There are authentic and inauthentic ways to do everything. The inauthentic way, Heidegger says, is to just do it because everybody else is doing it. Idle talk, chit-chat, gossip, buying what everybody else buys just because they buy it, right? Getting the new thing because it's the new thing and everyone else gets the new thing. That's inauthentic. Authentic is where everything, every decision that you're making is pointing back to what does this have to say about being? About my being specifically and about being more generally speaking. Again, not that you're inquiring all of the time, but you do always have, you're always attuned, it's a good Heideggerian word, you're always attuned to look for answers. You're expecting answers to be everywhere. And so you're attuned to them. Two examples. Example number one about the inauthenticity. Pardon me. My wife, that was creepy. My mother, her next door neighbor, the son of that family, is getting ready to go off to college. I think he's a freshman, sophomore in college now, something along those lines. And he plays basketball and he plays football. A few years ago, I happened to be at my mom's visiting, and he was outside, and he was getting ready for basketball season. And I know that prior to every basketball season, you gotta buy new basketball shoes, right? And this is a major investment, right? You need just the right shoe to play optimally, to play your best. So I asked him what shoes he was thinking about. So as I said, this was a few years ago. He was very excited about the CP3s. It's like, oh, he was going on and on and on about the CP3s, and I was like, so that's, they fit your foot well, you're gonna perform really well. I was like, I don't know, I haven't tried them on yet. It's like, whoa, hold on a second, then how do you know those are the ones you want? He said, because they look awesome, those are the ones everybody else is getting. He wants those because everyone else wants them. Classic inauthenticity. Now, Heidegger is, I think, fairly clear here. Others will disagree. I think he's fairly clear that this authenticity, inauthenticity thing is not necessarily a one-time, bam, now you're living life authentically, aha. There are moments here and there, moments of authenticity, moments of inauthenticity. All of us probably have moments of inauthenticity in our lives, doing things just because we've always done it or because everyone else does it. I'm not picking on or making fun of my mom's neighbor's son. We all have done this and continue to do it. Heidegger's cautioning against that, saying, look, we need to be a bit more authentic. We need to push being to the forefront a bit more. Right? And Heidegger gets, later in his writings, later in his philosophical career, gets very Buddhish, I'll say, not Buddhist, but Buddhish, very Buddha-like. And in one of his writings, he says the answer to the question of meaning of being, right? When heaven and earth all come together and everything is as one, can be summed up in the plop that a frog makes when it enters a pond. And if you're at all familiar with Far Eastern philosophy and Buddhism specifically, it sounds very much like a Zen koan of some type. right? Or some of these other very Zen things that people may have heard. What's the sound of one hand clapping? That doesn't really matter what the answer is, but it shifts your thinking away from, well, what's the meaning of being, to something more mundane and silly, which by shifting your thinking may trigger some type of answer to the question of meaning of being. Because these answers are everywhere, again, these clues. But it's this constant give and take between disclosure and hiding. As some aspects of being get disclosed, and this is a good Heideggerian term here, disclosed, revealed, unveiled, other aspects necessarily then get hidden and concealed. Because we can't have access to all of it all at once. So it is just going to be moments here, moments there, moments there. And again, this may or may not be very Buddhist. Buddhism is in conversation with itself on this issue. Whether this great awakening and great compassion that occurs, is this a one time when you're done, oh my goodness, everything is different from here on till the end? Or is it moments of enlightenment? Whoa, I see it now. And then you're back to the regular. And then, whoa, I see it again now. And then back to the regular. Heidegger, I think, again, Schrappe at least thinks that Heidegger's clear that it's these moments here, moments there, more so than the aha forever and ever. This attunement thing, then, if we properly attune to it, and he gets to this toward the end of the excerpt. He talks about things like mood. And again, this is a philosopher talking about something like emotions, which is very strange. Even in the 1920s, this is strange. And he talks about being attuned. What we indicate ontologically by the term state of mind is ontically, this is on page 120, the most familiar and everyday sort of thing, our mood, our being attuned. Now, in the digital age, this analogy has become a bit dated. But perhaps some of you may be familiar, maybe your parents, maybe your grandparents, maybe you're into old stuff because you think old stuff is cool, so you have something like this at your own place. But old analog radios and tuners and so forth, or even, in your car or something along those lines, if you have an older car, right, there were typically 2 or 3 dials. One of them was the volume, great. But over on the tuning side, there were usually 2. There was tuning, and then there was fine tuning. Okay, again, in the digital age, you just hit the button, it seeks and finds the, optimal wavelength of or bandwidth of the radio station. There you go. Well, again, back in the days when people listened to the radio instead of their Spotify or whatever, but you get the idea, right? 97.9 is not necessarily precisely what that bandwidth is for everyone everywhere throughout the city. In certain basements, it may be closer to 97.85 or 97.87 or 97.93. There's going to be slight variation based upon your specific location. Tuning gets you in the neighborhood. Fine tuning gets you precisely to the optimal for where you are at that given time so that you can hear the station the best. That's what he's talking about here, man. He's talking about being properly tuned, fine-tuned. Tuning gets you in the neighborhood. Oh yeah, being is somewhere. Fine-tuning is like, whoa, could there be an answer there? Could there be an answer there? Could there be an answer there? And 2 different people could be engaging in exactly the same activities, and one of them could be doing it authentically. The other could be doing it inauthentically. There's the word. It may turn out for my mom's neighbor's son that CP3s actually are the best for him also. That he can perform optimally with those shoes. That he gets those shoes because they're the best for him, not because everyone else is buying them. But we, the outsider, are not going to know which is which. Only the person living the life knows whether they're being authentic or inauthentic. Buying them because they actually are the best shoes for you, authentic. Buying them because everyone else is buying them, inauthentic. But you know what? The rest of us just see you buying them. We don't know. So this may have some correlation to Heidegger's Christian background, not judging others. We can't really judge whether others are being authentic or inauthentic. All we can do, at best, is judge whether we're being authentic or inauthentic, whether we're being genuine or not. Think about things like public apologies. It's very tough for me to determine whether they're genuinely apologetic or not. Right? You hear so many people, well, they're just sorry they got caught. Maybe. Who am I to say? How can I determine that? I'm not them. I don't know whether they're genuinely sorry or not. Presumably their actions will then demonstrate that down the road, but in the moment of the apology, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know whether they're authentic or inauthentic. And this also gets blurry because one of the other things that Heidegger talks about is our being with others. So there are three primary beings that he talks about. Being in the world, or necessarily in a world. Being with others, or necessarily with other folks. And being unto death. And I'll talk about each of those, but I'll talk about the being with others right now. An authentic way of being with others is allowing others to be themselves as well, so that they can then do this inquiry thing on their own, to the question of the meaning of being, get their own answers, but also so that we can engage in real conversation and dialogue, because you may have some answers that I hadn't thought about, I may have some answers you hadn't thought about yet, right? We both have to be willing to jump out of our nests of certainty here in order to get closer to the answer to the question of meaning of being. I've got my answers. How about yours? Wow, that's interesting. Haven't thought about that before. So we can all continue to progress, continue to grow intellectually and practically. Again, this is about practical philosophy, actual living life. Hopefully we can live better lives when we talk to one another. And this also then means we can't be oppressing and repressing others, right? That would be an inauthentic way of being with others. How can I use them, or something along those lines? That's inauthentic. That's inauthentic. Yeah. All right. So that's being with others. We've got this attunement mood. Think about how much easier it is to respect others when you've had a good night's sleep instead of a bad night's sleep. Right? When you're in a good mood rather than a bad mood. The same things could occur to you during that day, but the way that you understand them, the way that you contextualize them, the meaning that you find in those activities, in those occurrences and circumstances, completely different. What's changed? You. Your mood was different. That's all that changed, was your mood, and it changes everything. Because one mood, you're attuned properly. You have the right glasses on that you can see, ooh, wow, existence with others and being, and wow. Other days, you're pissy, you're in a bad mood, the glasses you have on are, the world sucks, Schopenhauer's right. And so, my wife, the mental health counselor, my best friend, the counselor, so on and so forth, work with their clients so much about just changing their mood, changing their attitude. So much out there about mental health right now, right? And one of the big things is, one, relax and breathe, blah, 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 right? But also take a moment to think about what's going well, right? There's a whole lot of crap that sucks right now, right? But part of the key here to good mental health, maybe a good life, is also focusing on, you know what, in my little corner of life, this stuff at least is going pretty well. Right? Having the right glasses on. Right? Being properly attuned based upon your mood. Let's see. A few more minutes here on this video. Back to 116 again. Second paragraph with the inquiry stuff. So again, it's guided by that which we're seeking. It's guided by the answer that we don't yet have, but we have it in some way. We have a little bit of it, right? And he talks about knowledge here. We do not know what being means. There's a couple of reasons why. One, if we already knew the answer, we wouldn't have to seek it anymore. We'd have our final nest of certainty. We wouldn't need to fly anymore. That's not life. It's not as if once we have this epiphany, once we fully understand the concept of being, we're suddenly swept up out of this world. We're still here. And so part of this being with others is not just allowing them the space to discover the answers to the meaning of being, but also to help them find the answers to the meaning of being, just as you would want them to help you as well. We're all in this thing together. To quote the late, great Prince, we're gathered here together to get through this thing called life. Gathered together. Yeah, I'd love to do a course just on Prince lyrics. Anyway. So we're not swept out. We're still in this world, right? Furthermore, we don't know in the intellectual sense. This type of being that he's talking about probably can't fully be articulated. That it's going to have to be a lived thing. It's sort of like the concept of love. Someone asks you, hey, think about a younger sibling who comes to you and says, hey, what's love? There may be certain things that you can say are not love, right? If someone is beating you, probably not love, that's probably abuse. If someone is ignoring you, wanting to spend more time on their own than with you, probably not love. If all they want is physical connection, wink wink, nudge nudge, maybe not love, that might just be lust. So we may be able to define love in some ways by what it's not, but to really give a good full description, and I know you can do the science thing, well, it's a series of synapses firing in the brain, that's great, doesn't make for a great Valentine's Day card. You set off certain synapses in my brain, blah blah blah. The pheromones which you emit just really, they don't speak to me obviously because it's a smell, right? They really smell to me, and it was love at first smell, which more and more research indicates it might be, by the way. Or wow, when I see you, I think about biology and procreation and all of that, or something along those lines. Quite romantical, yes. Good luck describing it fully. Will you get aspects? Will you get parts? Sure. But it's one of these huge abstract concept things. And are people going to disagree on specifics about it? Sure. But Schrappe is going to go with Heidegger here, because that's who I'm speaking on behalf of today, and presume there are still some universal things about it that we could all agree upon. Just like universal things about the concept of being. But just like love, you can't fully articulate this thing. You've got to live it instead. At some point you're left with, well, you'll know when it happens to you. Which sounds like a cop-out, but on the other hand, it also emphasizes experience. Like, you'll just know. Like, it might meet some of this criteria, it might meet some other criteria, it might not meet all this criteria, but it's a thing that happens to you, and then, whoa! It's a type of awakening thing. An authentic love versus an inauthentic love. Plus then you have the different types of love and so on and so forth. We may or may not get more into that at a later time. Okay? There's some interesting stuff to be said about all those things. And if we don't get into it now, take my intro to ethics class, we definitely get into it then. Okay? So we got this being with others, authentic versus inauthentic. You can't judge someone else's authenticity. At best you can only judge your own. Okay? And so you can't know it in an intellectual sense. It's an experiential thing. It's the experience of the frog in the pond. Whoa! I got it now. I had the experience. Again, somewhat Buddhist. It's the experience of the awakening and the enlightenment and the compassion. There's no step-by-step process how to get there, right? There are things that you could do to help, right? Right mindfulness and, right action, so on and so forth. But there's no guarantees that those things lead to the epiphany. Epiphanies just happen, man. There's no guarantees with any of it. They just happen. Whoa! But you got to be prepared for it. You have to be properly attuned so that you recognize it when it does happen, so you're ready in case it does. All right, that's probably a good place to stop this video, and then I'll pick up with Heidegger part 2 in just a moment.